For the love of the Master of the Martyrs, Aba Abdullah al-Hussein, Sallu ala Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. And for the love of Lady Zainab al-Kubra and Sayyida Kulthum, Sallu ala Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. And for the awaited Savior of humanity, Imam al-Mahdi, Ajjalallahu ta'ala faraj al-Sharif, Sallu ala Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين خاتم النبيين سيدنا الممجد بشير المصدق المصطفى الأمجد محمود الأحمد أبي القاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين ولعنة الله على الظالمين من الأولين والآخرين أما بعد فقد قال الله سبحانه وتعالى في كتابه المجيد وفرقانه الحميد وقوله الحق بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ظهر الفساد في البر والبحر بما كسبت أيدي الناس ليذيقهم بعض الذي عملوا لعلهم يرجعون آمنا بالله صدق الله العلي العظيم صلوا على محمد وآل محمد اللهم صل. Awaited Savior of humanity, Imam al-Mahdi alayhi salam, my respected teachers, elders, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. عظم الله أجورنا وأجوركم بمصابنا أبي عبد الله الحسين صلوات الله وسلامه عليه. What has the Muslim community contributed when it comes to the issue of environmental protection from the religion and the sources that we have? What has been the history of the development of capitalism such that these stages and eras have been the moments in which has caused capitalism to consume so much of every natural resource, and the way in which it has done it, such that it has put our planet and human community in a state of peril? And what is it that the faith and Muslim, and particularly the Shia community, has produced as a means of responding to this most urgent crisis? Do we find our Maraja al-Kiram writing and leading in this direction? What is it that we need to think about in terms of creating an Islamic eco-theology and environmental fiqh that allows us to be able to respond adequately and robustly to the challenges of our time? In the last two discussions, we asked ourselves about how we might fit the different explanations of the creation and introduction of coronavirus into our community. COVID-19 is arguably one of only three ways. Either it is a natural occurrence, or it is something created. If it is something created, it is either a spillover accidentally into the human community, or it was introduced purposefully. Whatever the answer may be, what we find is that Allah Jalla Jalaluhu tells us that the way in which we interact with our planet will determine how our planet interact with us. And last night, we went further into that thought and explored the way in which we understand the issue of ilmul ghaib and the sunan of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah has set up laws that govern both the physical and metaphysical realms. And the way in which we interact with those laws will determine how those laws interact back with us. And so when Allah Jalla Jalaluhu sets up certain physical laws, if we break them or we engage with those things which are haram or makruh for us, like any other thing that happens in the ordinary life that we lead, if we engage in haram and makruh, it comes back to us. In the system of creation, when we engage with haram and makruhat, it will come back to bite us. And so it helps us to think about the way in which we organize ourselves as a human community, especially when it comes to the creation, the transmission, and the eradication of disease, or indeed the issues surrounding global warming and climate change. For tonight's discussion and tomorrow's discussion, you and I are going to look at something new, inshallah. And what we want to be able to look at is how the Muslim community has responded to the issues of climate catastrophe and destruction, and whether we are actually producing something that can respond adequately or not. How have we reached here? How have we got to this point where we are consuming more from the planet than the planet can rejuvenate back for us? How have we got to the point that as a community, we ourselves are so ready to consume that at every point we are willing to be able to put everything on credit? We are willing to be able to buy one thing from across the planet, irrespective of the damage that it does to us. When we buy something, we have to realize that there's a carbon footprint to it. When we have anything when we engage in any part of ordinary behavior, we have to realize that we are using certain energies. And the question is whether we balance that use or whether actually we use more than what we are inclined to use. As a simple extrapolation, the West, and it only being one portion of the global community, uses more energy, resource than the rest of the world combined. We know the way in which we are living is unsustainable, and the way in which we live is actually consuming more energy, and the way in which that energy is then produced causes the reactions and actually comes back to bite us. There have been certain moments with the development of knowledge, development of science, development of even our economy that has allowed us to be able to reach to this point. For example, in the 17th century, the scientist Fahrenheit was able to measure accurately temperature, which is why now today we have Fahrenheit and Celsius. As a result of this, in the 18th century in Lancashire, we found that there were cotton looms that were beginning to run off the back of this most precise knowledge of heat. We then understood at what heat certain metals and chemicals could be produced. From this, we were then able to create an industrial revolution. And from this, the way in which we have moved forward in terms of the level of lifestyle that we have been living has moved faster in the last 200 years than in the rest of the human existence combined. We have now reached that stage with technological advancements that absolutely everything is available to us just at a click of a button. It is so phenomenal that when you look into certain ahadith, that A'imma alayhimus salam would have predicted the potential of this power. We have narration, for example, from our sixth Imam, Ja'far as-Sadiq, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayh, that in the end times, a person will be able to look into the palm of their hand and communicate with a person on the other side of the planet. It's not possible for an ordinary individual to have proposed this. We are talking about something that can only come with divine knowledge. It won't surprise you that there are narrations from Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam about global warming specifically. And we'll bring these narrations in the coming nights, inshallah. But with that knowledge also comes responsibility. And what you'll find within the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks to us about the balance between the blessings that He gives to us, the overconsumption of those blessings, and the outcome of the consumption of those blessings. Open your Qur'ans, inshallah. Everybody should have it out, readied by now. Open your Qur'ans. It can be on your apps. It can be on Google. Surah Al-Baqarah, chapter number 2, verse 205. Chapter number 2, Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 205. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. وَإِذَا تَوَلَّى سَعْيَ فِي الْأَرْضِ لِيُفْسِدَ فِيهَا وَيُهْلِكَ الْحَرْثَ وَالنَّسْلَ وَاللَّهُ لَا يُحِبُّ الْفَسَادِ. And when a person, when he turns away from you, Ya Rasulullah, when he turns away from you in the way in which is a proper Islamic, just, balanced lifestyle. وَإِذَا تَوَلَّى, when he turns away, سَعْيَ فِي الْأَرْضِ, he strives in the land. What does he strive to do? لِيُفْسِدَ فِيهَا, in order to be able to create corruption in the land. There is a direct relationship between leaving Islam, proper Islam, leaving the ideals and the lifestyle of Islam, and a person then following on by producing corruption from it. لِيُفْسِدَ فِيهَا وَيُهْلِكَ الْحَرْثَ. And not only does he create mischief and corruption in the land, he actually destroys the crops. وَيُهْلِكَ الْحَرْثَ. Which means what? You actually destroy the very things that you need for your own lifespan. Your own foods are being destroyed. That's not the end of it. وَالنَّسْلَ. And he even destroys the cattle and the living animals on the earth. Wallahu la yuhibbul fasad. Allah does not love this fasad. Allah does not love this mischief. We also have many verses that tell us about the obligation to protect our blessings. Chapter 16, verse 112, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَضَرَبَ اللَّهُ مَثَلًا قَرْيَةً كَانَتْ آمِنَةً مُطْمَئِنَّةً يَأْتِيهَا رِزْقُهَا. And Allah proposes to you a parable. Imagine a town that is once safe and secure, with all of its provisions coming in abundance from all places. Then they denied Allah's grace. So Allah caused them to experience misery and hunger. فَأَذَاقَهَا اللَّهُ لِبَاسَ الْجُوعِ وَالْخَوْفِ بِمَا كَانُوا يَصْنَعُونَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that the way in which we treat the planet can have a direct consequence with the way in which then we receive our blessings. The food, the livestock, the cattle, and the safety and security on our own earth. And there are many other verses that tell us about this as well. Once the human community began to realize that the way in which we are utilizing the earth's resources was being damaging to the planet, and that we were on a timeline towards self-destruction, since then the human community has strove hard to be able to make a change in its practices. However, the faith-based community has also tried to be able to make certain changes in the way in which they have responded to the crisis. what has been the stages by which the faith-based communities have come together to respond and react to the crisis of the way in which we are treating the planet? In a book, or in a thesis called The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis, Lynn White proposes that there have been 3 major stages in which the faith community have come together to respond to the ecological crisis afoot. The initial phase, which she refers to as eco-theology, where Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam have come together in some stages to work together, started in the 1970s. And according to her, this was actually created by Christian theologians who started to reflect back on their own theology of St. Thomas Aquinas' natural theology, highlighting the issue of human stewardship as opposed to domination over the whole planet. She argues that the Christian community in the 1970s were the first to lead from the faith-based charge to make a response to the ecological crisis. After this, in 1986, in Assisi in Italy, the various faiths came together in order to make a declaration called the Declaration of Assisi, in which the 5 world major religions declared their own beliefs and ethics which underlie the tradition's environmental message. In fact, at the opening of these 5 faiths coming together for the first time to make an international declaration, the Quran was read and translated as the means to start the entirety of this declaration and this conference in Italy in 1986. Thereafter, White says that in the 1990s, the 3rd stage of the eco-theological movement moved onwards. And what happened was that the various faiths began to dialogue regularly. They created a world parliament on religions. They started to arrange conservation programs in the name of their faith, and they even began to start colleges and institutions of environmental and ecological preservation in the name of their faith. I'm going to ask a question. First and foremost, from the entire Muslim community, I'm going to come to Shia in a second. From the Muslim community, can anyone here in this audience name an institution in the name of Islam that is there to help protect the environment, there to help protect the ecology, there to do research on behalf of the Quran, on behalf of the Ahadith, in regards to putting out publications and guidance on protecting our environment? Is there anyone? That tells you where we are. The fact that it has not reached the mass audience tells us how far behind we are. I move the question forward. And the reason why I ask these questions is because I want you to think that if this is genuinely the greatest challenge the earth, the collective human family is facing today, surely by now you would have heard what the Muslims are doing to respond to this challenge. النظافة من الإيمان. Ahsan, this is an important hadith. But is there an institution that you know of, a research center that is producing ijtihad, istinbat on fiqh al-bi'ah? We'll come to that, inshallah. Don't rush. So the question 1, from the Muslim perspective. Number 2, from the Shi'i perspective, does anyone know of a research institute that is doing ijtihad, istinbat, that is putting out guidance specifically on Islamic environmental ethics, Islamic ecological ethics? just for the sake of the camera and for my sisters, in both occasions to this question, not one hand has gone up or one answer has come out. Maybe our sisters have an answer, maybe someone online has an answer. I'm going to come to the question of the marja in a second. What we have to realize is that the Muslim community is far behind other communities when it comes to this most important question of our time. And there are many reasons for that. And we need to think deeply about what those reasons are. Despite this, it is recognized in Western academia that Islam has the best guidance on the preservation of the earth. Not Muslims, Western non-Muslim academia argue that when they review all the different faiths, when they write about what the faiths have to offer, Islam has the best. Let me give you a quote. Richard Foltz, leading academic in the sphere of environmentalism, Richard Foltz, anyone want to search his name, is F-O-L-T-Z, states the following: among the major universal religious traditions, Islam possesses perhaps the greatest sensitivity to the value of the natural resources and the need to preserve them. So according to researchers, we have the best that there is to offer of the faiths. But you have to ask yourself, has this translated into anything practical for you? Now I come to this question that the Sayyid has thought of already. Who can tell me if there is any marja al-kiram, may Allah preserve them and bless them for the phenomenal work that they do in leading us. However, this is a constructive criticism and we need to think for ourselves and respond in kind. Is there a marja that has put out a fiqh work responding to the specific questions on how we live our life and interact when it comes to the issue of issue of environment? Everyone here, you muqallideen of different maraji, you spend your time listening to majalis, you read books, you're on the internet. Every time that there is a masala, this person is arguing this way, this person puts out this thread, all the nonsense. Is there one book, mas'ala, fiqhi masail, telling you about the issues of pollution, the issue of meat, the issue of consumption? Is there one book of masail? There isn't. And this is a shame. This means that we are very behind. Now here we need to think deeply about this issue. When we said that Richard Foltz states that Islam has the best to offer when it comes to preserving the planet, what we mean by that is that Islam has the best ethic to revitalize the ecology and environment of the planet. And that when we begin to think and research and live this, it provides us with an impetus by which we can uncover the true Islamic tradition when it comes to preserving the planet. It also helps us to be able to reform the distorted worldviews that we have inherited. Because we live within a capitalistic society, we inherit the modus operandi of a capitalistic society. We fall in line with its norms, the way in which we purchase, the way in which we waste. Whereas the moment the issue of Islamic environmental ethics is raised and we begin to think about our own practices, we begin to push back at the capitalistic way of living, and we start to be able to think about the distortions that have come to us and actually reform our behaviors back in line with Islamic behavior itself. Now, we stated earlier that according to Lynn White, there have been 3 stages of when faiths have come together to be able to move forward in the sphere of Islamic or sphere of eco-theology. Many of the Shi'i scholars have been producing great work. We're going to mention those now in a second for you. Arguably, however, our Sunni brothers are far ahead when it comes to producing work of theology and ahkam and even research centers than the Shia community. And it should not be like this. In the 1970s, Sayyid Hussein Nasr wrote an abundant work on the issue of environmentalism. One of the first Shi'i scholars to do this. In fact, he writes something very important. He says the way in which we treat the planet is a direct reflection of how we treat our souls and our own bodies. When we are willing to put our own bodies to waste, the thing that is most precious to you and I, do you not imagine for a second that we will be willing to trample upon anything else within creation? The more respect that you have for your own body, for your own mind, will be a direct relationship to the amount of respect you have for the world that surrounds you. He argues in his environmental works. He was one of the first Shi'i scholars to write on it. After that, Ayatollah Sayyid Muhammad Hussein al-Shirazi, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayh, he produced a leading work called Fiqh al-Bi'ah. Bi'ah means environment. And we'll talk about this word as we go through the series, inshallah, its root and its application. Fiqh al-Bi'ah is the fiqh of bi'ah, of environment. Now, he didn't write a fiqh, يعني masail, ahkam. When he wrote fiqh, he meant tafaqahu fi ad-din, the way in which we can understand matters of the environment. Arguably, according to my research, he was the first marja to write an entire dedicated book on the issue of the environment. I mentioned in a previous lecture, we talked about Ayatollah Jawadi Amuli. A book is available even in English on Islamic environmentalism. You can buy this and read this for yourself. We also have, for example, Ayatollah Muhaqqiq Damad. He has written a number of papers on the issue of Islamic environmental protections and available mainly in Farsi. After that, arguably the best work in the Shi'i community is by someone by the name of Ayatollah al-Sheikh Hussein Khashan, who is the head of the Hawza in Lebanon, or representative of Ayatollah Sayyid Muhammad Hussein Fadlullah, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayh, has also put out a phenomenal work and is arguably the most progressive Shi'i work that is available. The title of the work is Steps Toward a Fiqh of Bi'ah. Can you see? Look at the title. Khutawat, steps towards it. Meaning what? Even in the title, we still don't have a fiqh of Bi'ah. Otherwise, he wouldn't be saying steps towards it. He would be titling it a bab on fiqh of Bi'ah. We do not yet have an usul al-fiqh. We do not yet have an ijtihad as a bab. And we do not yet have a dedicated bab producing masail for fiqh al-Bi'ah. Only last year, His Eminence Grand Ayatollah Sayyid Muhammad Taqi al-Mudarrisi was part of an international conference in Europe, in Iceland, leading the Shi'i voice on environmentalism. We had the honor of arranging that for him. The office of the Prime Minister, of Iceland, one of his campaign promises that we would bring faiths together in order to be able to speak about environmental protection. And after being elected, his secretariat reached out to different faith institutions and said that we want representatives from all the leading faiths. When we were contacted, we did suggest that the representatives of His Eminence and Imam al-Mujahid, Sayyid Ali Khamenei, participate. Sadly, the office of the Prime Minister actually said no. And the reason for that, the information that came back to us was, Iran is seen as controversial. We're not sure if they should represent the Shi'i faith or not. It's not something that I have control over. I'm just reporting to you what happened in my experience. Because the office of Sayyid Khamenei was not accepted, we reached out to the office of Sayyid al-Marja al-Mudarrisi, may Allah preserve them both, and Grand Ayatollah Sayyid Muhammad Taqi al-Mudarrisi gave a video lecture and was part of a number of conferences over the days with the world's faith forums with the office of the Prime Minister of Iceland, and this happened only last year. The point is, we are moving forward, but we are far, far away from where we need to be. However, in the Sunni community, arguably, they have produced far more literature in terms of theology, in terms of ahkam, and even research centers, and even universal declarations in helping us to be able to create an ethical environmentalism within Islam. A few names you can research for yourself. For example, Dr. Fazlun Khalid has a research center in Birmingham, International Research Center on Birmingham. I would argue probably the leading scholar in the world on Islamic environmentalism, Dr. Fazlun Khalid. You have, for example, Dr. Iyad Abu Mughli. Dr. Iyad, with the United Nations Environmental Program, the UNEP, actually set up a faith forum with the UNEP, so that faiths have a space to be able to present their research, their work at the United Nations. For example, we have a great scholar in Saudi by the name of Uthman Llewellyn. Llewellyn, a convert, a white convert to Islam. Uthman Llewellyn, arguably one of the best minds out there when it comes to environmental ethics from the Islamic perspective. We also have, for example, a lady by the name of Najma Muhammad. All of these leading scholars have produced at the highest level for the Muslims to be able to have access to. Three of these names I just mentioned, Dr. Fazlun Khalid, Iyad Abu Mughli, Uthman Llewellyn, they are actually writing the world's first Islamic declaration on environmental ethics. You can research this. If you go open, please, just for a second. Get onto Google for a second. Type in the following: Al-Mizan, UN, is in United Nations. Al-Mizan, UN, Fazlun Khalid. F-A-Z-L-U-N, Fazlun Khalid. What should come up in the first 2-3 searches is this first leading global document where the global leading Muslim scholarship have come together to produce a declaration of Islamic environmental ethics. It is in draft and it will be, inshallah, presented to the United Nations next year for its ratification, such that we can then have a Muslim document to say, this is what the Quran, this is what the Ahadith, and this is what all the leading schools of thought say on this particular matter, how we have reached to this problem, what Islam says, and what Muslims call for to make a difference when it comes to environmental ethics. Alhamdulillah, there is one Shi'i representative in writing this document. And if you go and open the document in your own time, you will read all the different core contributors and also the contributors, including the Shi'i representative for this United Nations document. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. I won't give it away who the Shi'i representative is for this United Nations document. You can find it in your own time, inshallah. No giving the name, no giving the name. What we have to realize is that the Muslim community, and particularly the Shi'i community, has to mobilize in this remit. And it starts by the production of a detailed theology about our relationship to the environment, followed by a fiqh and ahkam in relationship to the environment. Why is this the case? Why do we need an ethical and theological and fiqhi legal system when it comes to Islamic environmental ethics? There are 4 reasons. Hussein Nasr, in one of his works in 1992, says the following, that the ethical treatment of the environment cannot take place without an emphasis upon the teachings of the divine law, and hence upon the ethical and religious consequences for the human soul. When you and I do a halal or haram act, does it impact our soul? Yes or no? Yes. However, if we don't know what our legal Islamic duties are when it comes to environmental protection, ecological preservation, if we are doing something that is haram, is it going to affect our soul? Yes, of course it is. So we need to be able to produce something in order to preserve our own soul. We don't have a right to stand before Allah on the Day of Judgment and say, I don't know whether I was legally, Islamically allowed to be able to, I don't know, if I was legally allowed to be able to just destroy the environment, to pollute the environment. You can't stand there before Allah and say, I don't know. Someone will say, well, we don't know because we don't have it produced. That's the point. Since 1992, Sayyid Hussein Nasr has been calling for a fiqh of ahkam, of bi'ah, in order for us to know what is halal and haram for us in our interactions with the environment. Secondly, second reason as to why we need to be producing in these areas is that many Muslims, although they understand that there is a secular law out there, whilst of course we respect the secular law, we are Muslims first. We believe in an Islamic law. It's one thing, the secular law telling us we're allowed to live in a certain way. Don't you want to know what the Islamic law says about certain things? Let me give you an example. And we're going to talk about this in detail in maybe 2 nights' time, inshallah. Arguably, the single biggest contributor to greenhouse gases is what? I mentioned this the other day. What is it? Yeah, methane from cows. And why so much methane going into the environment? Why? Because of the amount of cows. Why? Because of the amount of beef we are eating. Now I'm going to ask a simple fiqhi mas'ala. Imagine you are sitting with His Eminence, Grand Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Hussein al-Sistani. May Allah preserve him. Imagine you're sitting in his presence and you say to him, Sayyid al-Marja al-A'la of our time, we have come from the West on ziyarah, thank you for your time. We have a question for you. He says, of course, go ahead, I'm all ears. What's the question? You say, there's a hadith of the Holy Prophet of Islam, Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alih. The Prophet has narrated to have said, and all of the fuqaha agree that the Prophet said this, and they use it in fiqh. The Prophet said, La dharar wala dhirar. No harm, no harming. You are not allowed to have harm to come to you, nor allowed to do harm to something else. Islam does not occasion harm. Sayyidina, the single biggest thing that is harming the planet is our overconsumption of meat. Unless we stop eating meat or reduce it to drastically close to zero, we are on a head-on collision to destroy the planet and make parts of our planet uninhabitable. People will die. Based upon this hadith, we are not permitted to do harm, and we know for a scientific fact that this thing is causing the biggest harm. Is it permissible for me to eat meat? Now, I'm not saying to you it is permissible, it's not permissible. Do you understand? I'm showing you the importance of needing a fiqh, the importance of needing an ethics, the importance of needing an aqa'id related to this matter that doesn't just sit in the hawza ilmiya, it doesn't just sit in academia, it reaches you and I so that it regulates the way in which we are living, so that we're not reliant on secular law, but rather that you and I are reliant on Islamic law, the law of Ahl al-Bayt alayhimus salam and the Quran. Third reason as to why we would want to have an Islamic theology, an Islamic ethics, and an Islamic law for the environment is that so many of us are looking for solutions. You and I want solutions on how we live, right? This is the biggest issue of the era. And a fourth reason is this, that so long as we do not produce, others are going to produce and take the lead on the matter. Which means we will always follow others as opposed to us being followed. Islam is supposed to have the solutions. Islam is supposed to lead. We are supposed to be shuhada ala nas. But if we are not producing in these areas, then we are not shuhada. We're not witnesses over. We're not the position to lead. Rather, we are going to be following behind everybody else. Let us take maybe one or two theological masail so that we can think about what questions arise when it comes to an Islamic eco-theology. If you want to open your Qur'ans again, everybody. Turn to Surah Al-Baqarah, chapter number 2, verse number 29. Surah Al-Baqarah, verse number? Ahsant. Everybody's there? Everybody? Look up, tell me, nod, yes? Ahsant. Have a read of this verse with me, inshallah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. هو الذي خلق لكم ما في الأرض أرض جميعا. He it is, Allah, who has created for you all that is on the earth. ثم استوى إلى السماء فسواهن سبع سماوات وهو بكل شيء عليم. He it is who has created for you everything that is on the earth and has applied his design to the heavens and fashioned them into 7 heavens. He alone has full knowledge of this matter. Now, this is very important. Everybody understand. The way in which the studies ijtihad on language, mubahith al-alfadh, works is that certain words are known as muqayyad and certain words are known as mutlaq. Some words limit. Some words give you an open expanse and say everything is allowed until proven otherwise. Have a look at this verse. هو الذي خلق لكم ما في الأرض جميعا. Tell me, is this muqayyid, is this a limitation, or is this mutlaq, absolute? Who can tell me? Does this verse limit our use, put a qaid, a limitation on our access and usage of the planet, or does it give us carte blanche? Which one? Carte blanche. The scholars normally interpret this ayah as a mutlaq ayah. You have access to everything on the planet. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has many verses. سَخَّرَ لَكُم مَا فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَمَا فِي الْأَرْضِ. Allah has given it to you. He's made it for you. You could use everything in the planet. Ayatollah Hadi Ma'rifat, may Allah bless his soul, a giant mufassir of our age, says the following about this ayah in Surah Al-Baqarah. This is amongst the foremost principles, that permission is given to mankind to make use and enjoy everything in nature, so long as it does not prohibit, harass, or stop another from their rights. It's very important. Allah has said you can use everything, but are we allowed to be able to use everything in such a way that it destroys the resources of our planet? No. That's not permitted. Think about this carefully. Imagine you have a tree. The tree is an apple tree. The tree is producing apples. You can take one apple, can't you? And in the knowledge that tomorrow that tree will produce another apple. What happens when you knock down the entirety of the tree? What happens when you pull up the tree entirely? Yes, you'll have the 20 apples, not pulling one off at a time. You'll have all 20. But will you have another tree to reproduce? Yes or no? No. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said everything has access for you in this earth. You want to be able to dig oil? No problem. You want to be able to fish? No problem. You want to be able to fell the trees? No problem. But can you do it in such a way that eventually the whole thing becomes destroyed and is no longer available to you? No, this is not permissible for you and I. There are many ayat that tell us that actually you and I have a responsibility in the way in which we look after the planet, and that when we misuse the resources, this will actually be our destruction. Open your Qur'ans, chapter number 46, Surah Al-Ahqaf. This is a very important verse. Chapter number 46, Surah Al-Ahqaf, verse number 20. Everybody is there? Yes? Anybody need more time to reach there? Ahsan. Verse number 20. Read it with me. I'm going to read it in Arabic first. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. وَيَوْمَ يُعْرَضُ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا عَلَى النَّارِ. And on the day when those who disbelieve shall be brought before the fire. Is this a positive verse or a negative verse? Negative. It's threatening, isn't it? It's something telling you about nar of Jahannam. أَذْهَبْتُمْ طَيِّبَاتِكُمْ فِي حَيَاتِكُمُ الدُّنْيَا. Why were you dragged towards the fire? Why do you end up in the fire on the day of judgment? أَذْهَبْتُمْ طَيِّبَاتِكُمْ. You did away with the good things that God gave to you. Subhanallah, look how the Quran speaks. It's amazing when we read the Quran and we join up verses. أَذْهَبْتُمْ ذَهَبَ. It's going to go away from you. طَيِّبَاتِكُمْ. All of the pure things, all of the good things that Allah has gifted to you, you did away with them. You wasted them, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says. When did you waste them? فِي حَيَاتِكُمُ الدُّنْيَا. In your own life. Now, this is really interesting. When you do tadabbur of Quran, you really open up certain questions. Fi hayatikum. In your lives, in your lifespans. Tell me, how long is the ordinary lifespan of a human being? 80 odd years, right? The ayah is saying, in your own lifespans, within the space of 50 years, 80 years, you did away with all the tayyibat that I gave to you? All the resources, the gas, the oil. Imagine. Even the fisheries we are plundering. You know, the United Nations, a few years back, put out a statement. It said that global fishery stocks will be completely eradicated by the year 2050. That's at the rate of our fishing. Eradicated. No more fish. What do you think happens when there's such a reduction of fishery stocks in the seas? Anyone who's seen the documentary Seaspiracy will know what comes next. 2050. What year is it now? How long to go? 30 odd years. في حياتكم الدنيا. in your own lives of this world, you did away with the tayyibat that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave to you. This tells us very clearly that the way in which we have to be able to manage the resources has to come from an Islamic perspective. For without it, you and I end up just following the secular whims. We end up following global capitalism. We end up following disaster capitalism. Why? Because we still do not have guidance in the way in which you and I ought to be living. And we're going to interrogate this further and further in the coming days, inshallah. His Eminence, Ayatollah Jawadi Amuli, may Allah bless him, in his book, Islamic Environmentalism, says the following: the Quran exhorts humankind to make good and balanced use of its natural resources. The fulfillment of this divine order involves mining, agriculture, and generally any productive form of benefit from raw material available to you in nature. The Quran has already spoken about this principle. And so, what we have to remember is that when it comes to our Islamic theology, Islamic eco-theology, there are one of three ways that you and I can live. We're going to explore this more tomorrow, inshallah. One is we can become egocentric. Egocentric means the way in which we live is purely for me and me alone. It doesn't matter what happens to you. And so the way in which I use all my resources is just for my own ego, egocentric. Another way in which we can use the resources will be human-centric. Fine. I use the resources, but for the sake of all of humanity. And the third way that we can use and interact with the rest of creation is not egocentric. It is not human-centric, but it is ecocentric. It is for the rest of the planet to share in abundance as we share in abundance. For them to prosper the way you and I prosper. To protect the rest of the planet the way in which I expect to be protected. Your homework is the following. Find me one ayah of the Quran where a prophet of Allah interacts with an animal and ensures its protection from the rest of creation. What is the homework? To find a story in the Quran of a prophet who interacts with creation in order to protect it so that it doesn't become destroyed. And you will see whether Islam is egocentric or whether it is human-centric or ecocentric in its entirety. You know, on that night in which Imam Ali alayhi salam was struck on his blessed forehead, he comes in and out of his house and he's looking up at the sky and he says, indeed this is the night in which I have been promised my destiny. His daughter, Sayyida Kulthum salamullahi alayha, cries and says, oh my father, I've never heard words like this from you. What do you mean? As he departs his house for that last time before he is struck on his blessed head, you all know this story in the gham, the maqtal of Imam Ali alayhi salam. What does he see in the courtyard of his house? Geese. You all know this story. He turns towards his daughter, Sayyida Kulthum alayha salam, and says, oh my daughter, look after these geese, for they have a right upon you. Animals have huquq, they have rights, a right to live, a right to prosper, a right not to be destroyed for the sake of their destruction. Oh, my dear daughter, look after these geese, feed them, and if you can't, let them go free For their rizq is with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Think about this. The last hadith, one of the last hadith we have from the master, from the commander of the faithful, before he is struck on that night, is about looking after the planet. You and I, we have to produce, we have to expect and demand this from our institutions, from our scholarship, and then it needs to be able to reach us such that we can then reform our lives accordingly. In the absence of that, doesn't mean nothing changes. This series will help tell you what is the latest research and questions when it comes to this topic. Inshallah, you and I can start to make that movement such that we can look after our planet. Imagine a person who is so conscientious of the way in which he lives that when he's a guest in the house of that lady who looked after him, when the armies of Ibn Ziyad surrounded his house, Hazrat Muslim ibn Aqil alayhi salam said, I do not want an attack on your house. I will leave now. That's how conscientious he was of his environment. How conscientious he was of the surroundings around him. This is why Muslim ibn Aqil, salamullahi alayhi, was the ambassador of Aba Abdullah al-Hussein. When you reach that level of conscientiousness, immediately the Imam himself opens his arms to you and deploys you back into the world to show the level of conscientiousness that you have. Hazrat Muslim, when he is running from street to street to try to avoid the capture, thirst is overcoming him. When he is captured, he is taken onto the roof and he is beheaded. His head is placed on the door of Masjid Kufa as a warning to others. Do you know where his body was kept? Do you know how he was treated? Do you know how the Banu Umayyah treated other human beings, other creation? They left the body of Muslim ibn Aqil on the trash piles of Kufa. Look at the difference between the mu'min and the way in which he lives and the way in which Banu Umayyah live. It was at this moment in his last seconds when he calls out, Assalamu alayka ya Aba Abdullah. You can imagine that call reaches the ears of Imam al-Hussein. He turns towards the daughter of Muslim ibn Aqil. He comes and strokes her head. She says, this is only the way in which you act when there is an orphan. Tell me, what is the outcome of my father? To which Imam al-Hussein responds by saying, I am now your father. My daughters are now your sisters. My sons are now your brothers. You are now directly into our family. We will be looking after you from here on in. ألا لعنة الله على القوم الظالمين وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون إنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to hasten the appearance of Imam al-Mahdi alayhi salam, to allow us to be alongside him at all times in our life and in our death. If we are to pass away from this world before his coming, Ya Allah, raise us from our graves so that we can partake in the victories of Muhammad and Ali Muhammad. We ask you, Ya Allah, help us to be able to reform our behaviors, help the Muslim and particularly the Shi'i community become a lead for humanity in dealing with the climate and environment. Walhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina wa Nabiyyina Muhammad wa alihi at-tahirin.